Thomas Warrick, a senior fellow at the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security's Forward Defense Practice at the Atlantic Council. Previously, he was the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Counterterrorism Policy at the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. And he joins me also from Washington, D.C. Good to have you on the program with us. We heard from U.S. President Biden saying that he will work with Republicans, even if they do take control of Congress. We know that Republicans and Democrats are far apart on domestic issues, but when it comes to foreign policy, is there room for agreement?
Yes, there is actually broad unanimity on a number of the key challenges the United States faces. There's a strong bipartisan consensus for supporting Ukraine in its defense against Russian aggression. There is bipartisan support for a tougher line on China, precisely where President Biden has staked it out that the United States would be prepared to work with China in areas like climate change, but is going to oppose any effort by China to change things militarily in the East Asia and Western Pacific area. On Iran, President Biden is going to be faced by a challenge sparked somewhat by the new Israeli government over how to deal with Iran's nuclear program if they should attempt to try to restart that. But the Republicans are actually just as tough as the Democrats are in terms of opposing an Iranian nuclear program. So I actually think on some of the most pressing security challenges, there's a good chance that Democrats and Republicans will, in general, be working together.
So on the issue of the war in Ukraine, I know that there had been concern that if Republicans took control of Congress, that a lot of that support would end. So do you think that we will continue to see aid from the U.S. in the form of weapons and money being sent to Ukraine?
Well, the Republican leader, at the behest of a small faction of the Republican wing in the Congress, has tried to say there will be no blank checks to Ukraine. But in fact, as President Biden rightly said, there actually have been no blank checks given to Ukraine in the war so far. The United States has withheld some of the more advanced weapons that Ukraine could use to defend itself. And obviously, I think that what happens with those advanced weapons will depend in part on what happens in the battlefield and whether Ukraine is able to regain some of its territory that Russia has occupied. So at this point, I think there's likely to be a considerable effort before the new Congress comes in with the old Congress to pass an aid package for Ukraine, simply to take this issue off the table so that the president and the Congress can focus on other, especially domestic issues in which there are disagreements.
Where do you see relations with China going? Because former President Trump took a really hardline stance against China, but Joe Biden hasn't walked back any of those measures. And now that we have President Xi Jinping reelected for a third term in China, do you see relations between the two countries continuing to go down?
It's not a question that they're going down. In effect, this is like a breakup where there was a time when there was hope in the United States and the West that China would go down a path of economic development and prosperity, but in fact, they've chosen to go down a repressive path. They've targeted the Muslim Uyghur population in what both administrations, Trump and Biden, senior officials have described as acts of genocide even. And some of the other things that China has done to threaten Taiwan, in particular, a democracy that is actually the source of most of the world's computer chips in many categories. And so these kinds of threats are not looked upon at all well by Democrats and Republicans. And I think what we'll see is the United States working to get other countries in Europe and the Middle East to see China in this same way that the United States now does.
All right, we'll leave it there. Thomas Warrick joining us from Washington, D.C. Thank you.
You're welcome.